This tutorial I'm going to say something about the historical and geographical background of pre-Socratic philosophy. We see a timeline here, so we're going to have some history. We see a map here, we're going to have some geography. Here it is on our timeline, pre-Socratic philosophy, starting around 600 BC, lasting until about 400 BC. These dates are approximative. I'm not going to look onto 50 years here, so we're going to be a little bit large-scale history. 600 BC, this is a moment when the Greeks realized that these myths that they have just tell a story on how gods, are the cause of certain natural phenomena, but these myths really differ from place to place. They realized this, and then they said, shouldn't we just try to look for more rational stories, which perhaps everybody could agree upon, and philosophy was really the start to give rational arguments in trying to come up with explanations for natural events, rather than telling traditional stories about gods. So here you have mythical thinking, which is substituted for philosophical thinking. Here philosophy starts. And pre-Socratic philosophy is really the start of this philosophy. Okay, 600 BC, if we look just in general history, this is the beginning of classical antiquity. Classical antiquity in history starts around 800 BC and lasts until about 580. Okay, look at this timeline here. Somewhere you have the year 0. Doesn't really exist a year 0, but 0 point, where BC before Christ turns into AD, Anno Domini, the year of the Lord, after Christ. So classical antiquity is from 800 BC to 580. Classical antiquity is typically subdivided into different periods. You have, first of all, the Archaic period, and this is really the period where pre-Socratic philosophy starts. The Archaic period starts in about 800 BC and lasts until about 500 BC. Okay, remember, pre-Socratic philosophy started around 600 BC. After the Archaic period, you get the period of Classical Greece. Classical Greece, starting around 500 BC, lasting until around 300 BC. Very important moment in literature, etc., politics, and also for philosophy, as we'll later see. Around 300 BC, we got a new period starting, namely the Hellenistic period. I'm just going to continue doing this timeline a little bit, right? It doesn't really have to do with the Pre-Socratics anymore, but let's just finish it. The Hellenistic period, which lasts until about 150 BC, and during this period, you have the Roman Republic, which gains power, and around 100 BC, Rome turns into a big empire. So this is the period of the Roman Empire, 100 BC until about 500 AD, where also classical antiquity ends, and where the Middle Ages start. So here you get a new macro period, the Middle Ages, and a new macro kind of philosophy, namely medieval philosophy. Pre-Socratic philosophy is the beginning of ancient philosophy. Ancient philosophy is just a philosophy in classical antiquity, or wherever it might have started, okay, which then turns into medieval philosophy. Alright, so far for history. Let me perhaps just make one note here, and that is about the name Pre-Socratic philosophy. I mean, why do they call it Pre-Socratic philosophy? And you might have guessed why. Because it's before Socrates. However, if you know something about the history of philosophy, you might know that Socrates lived from around 469, so around here, till 399. Okay, so this is the death of Socrates. This is a date which is easy to remember, and some students do remember it. Some remember it wrong, 299 or something, but here it is. Socrates is sentenced to death. So apparently he lived in the period of pre-Socratic philosophy, which is a little bit strange, but The point is that the philosophy which comes afterwards is really starting with Plato, and then you have Aristotle, and this is really afterwards. It's really in Plato where we find descriptions of Socrates' philosophy. So Socrates himself didn't really write stuff down. And the contemporaries of Socrates really had another idea about what philosophy is. So they're really at home in this Pre-Socratic philosophy. So, but anyway, these are just categorizations and never fit for 100%. So, you know, it will just, let it just be a warning not to take these terms too seriously. Okay, this is enough about history. Now let's really turn to geography. And it's important to know something about the geography of pre-Socratic philosophers, because the philosophers will often name philosophical schools on the basis of geographical locations. You might have heard about Milesians or Eleatics or the school of Ionia, and these all refer to places. So where did these philosophers live? It's not around Athens or mainland Greece, but it's more peripheral, you know. Just for the record, this here is Italy, this is Greece, this is Turkey, this is sea. Okay, and I wrote down some philosophers like Heraclitus, Thales, Pythagoras, Parmenides, etc. And so they're around here. This area is called Ionia. Ionia. And in Ionia you have two famous places, or three famous places, two on the mainland, one island. You have Ephesus, where the famous philosopher Heraclitus lived. You have Miletus, where a number of philosophers lived, such as Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. And these philosophers are called the Milesians exactly because they lived in Miletus. On the island Samos, we also have a very famous philosopher, mathematician, Pythagoras. Nevertheless, we're not really going to count Pythagoras as belonging to the Ionia school. We're going to count him to the southern Italian school. This is because his disciples actually lived in southern Italy. His ideas spread towards these parts, so even though he was born in Samos and lived in his philosophy, we're going to call it part of southern Italy philosophy. Okay, I mean, again, Socrates lived in the Pre-Socratic period, and Pythagoras belongs to southern Italian philosophy. So be it. It doesn't really fit 100%, but that's how philosophers apparently chose to subdivide all these ideas. There was not only Pythagoreans in the philosophy of southern Italy. We had a place called Elea, which brought forth a number of important philosophers, such as Parmenides and Zeno, and these philosophers are called Eleatics, exactly again because they lived in Elea, and it's just as simple as that. Okay, recapitulate. We had Ionia, this part here, where there were a couple of pre-Socratic philosophers. We had southern Italy, where there were living a couple of pre-Socratic philosophers, and also the disciples of other philosophers. And then within Ionia, we had this town called Miletus, which produced the Milesians. Sometimes we also talk about the Ephesians, and Heraclitus is then part of the Ephesian school, but it's not, you know, Milesian is really common because there's this bunch of important philosophers. And the same for Eleatics. In southern Italy, we have the school of Eleatics, to which belong Parmenides and Zeno. And this is all I will tell about geography and history. I won't bore you any longer, and in the next tutorial I will actually do pre-Socratic philosophy, which hopefully will be a little bit more interesting.